Everyone. Welcome to our Fireside chat with a few founders talking about data startups. We've got Gary Lynn from Explo, Barry McCardle from Hex, and Christina Gilbert from One Schema. I'm Aaron Harris. I'm the founder of Magid and Company. And before that, I was a partner at Y Combinator for quite a while. And so I've had the pleasure of talking to a lot of startups. About what they do and why and what's interesting about it, and hoping to get a little bit of that type of information today. So thanks again for joining, and we're just going to jump right in. So Gary, let me start with you and say thanks for hosting the Fireside. Tell me what Explo is I'll give you two sentences.
Yeah, Explo builds customer-facing dashboards and analytics. So we make it really easy for companies to build out an analytics suite and embed it into their own product for their customers to analyze and see.
All right. So am I thinking about the sort of the Stripe dashboard, but anyone can build that for themselves?
Exactly, without needing like an engineering team to kind of be staffed to build out these dashboards, kind of like plug and play, super easy to embed and utilize.
Cool. All right. Thanks. Christina, what's One Schema?
Yeah, so like Explo, OneSchema is an embeddable developer tool, but ours is a CSV importer. So engineering and product teams at SaaS companies use OneSchema to bypass the work of building and maintaining CSV import, a deceptively difficult technical problem. And we help SaaS companies increase their activation and onboarding rates because usually CSV import is sort of at the beginning of the customer adoption journey for a SaaS product.
All right. So I was uploading a CSV last week to my 401k provider, and it was a pain in the butt because you had to format in this really specific way, and then obviously it broke because there was an extra space in a column somewhere, and I had no idea what was going on. You fix that?
That's exactly right. So if your 401k provider purchased OneSchema, OneSchema would deal with a lot of work to reformat the data, clean it up, help you resolve your issues if they're ones that we can't fix ourselves, and hopefully improve your 401k provider's onboarding rates and get more people to use their platform.
Got it. Thank you. And Barry.
Hey, I'm Barry. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hex. Hex is a platform for collaborative data science and analytics. You can kind of think of it like Google Docs or Figma for data. We take all these local fragmented workflows, bring them online, make them collaborative, give our users new superpowers, and make it very easy for them to collaborate and communicate with the type of data work they're doing.
Okay, so if I and my co-founder wanted to, I don't know, run a bunch of SQL queries together, and we didn't want to send screenshots of our queries back and forth. We actually just wanted one place where we could say, oh, what does this thing do and that thing do? We could do it on Hex.
That is our race on death. Yeah, we have SQL, Python, and no code live together in one UI. So you can come in, connect to your data, run queries, share the outputs, and it all lives in one collaborative interface that works like you'd expect from modern productivity tools.
Okay, so there's a real common thread that I'm hearing from the three of you, which is built around this idea of interface, right? Data has always been this thing. Data has always lived somewhere, right? And the ways that we access it have changed over time. And but each of you are focused on this idea of interface. So I'm curious who your users are, because that dictates a lot of what we do with things. Christina, who are your users?
Yeah, so the customers we sell to as a company are engineers and product managers at SaaS companies. And the problem that we solve for them is building and maintaining a CSV importer and helping them build a better CSV import experience. But just as important to us as our customers are our customers' customers, because they're the ones that are actually importing CSV files into our customers' products. So to this point about interface, we think of ourselves as a tool for managing the long tail of data import workflows, because in a lot of cases, you could leverage an integration to get data into your product, or something that works better with structured data. But there are always going to be these use cases where the data isn't perfectly structured. You mentioned, missing white space, missing commas, that you need a tool that's a little bit more flexible to have the data effectively get into your product.
The idea of a customer's customer is kind of confusing. Right? Because it's hard to figure out if your customer's customer is happy with what you're doing. So how do you decide whether or not you're doing a good job at that much of a remove from the end user?
Absolutely. That's a really difficult question that we face because it's hard to get face time with your customers' customers. We do rely a lot on customer interviews with our customers because they can give us feedback about what our customers, their end customers are saying. And they often really care. Sorry, we internally we call them customer and customer prime to differentiate.
Good. I was going to say we need a new term.
Yeah, so in all of our docs, people call it customer P, customer prime. So our customers will give us feedback about what customer prime is saying because whenever they have a really great import, often they'll say, wow, this was an amazing feature that you guys provided. Or if there's an issue, they'll say, we wish that your importer tool did this. And then our customers pass that feedback back to us and we iterate and the product improves over time.
Gary, you have the same kind of issue, right, with the customer?
No, for sure. So yeah, our customers buy Xplo to show these dashboards to their customers, and we
call them customer and customer prime.
We call them customer and end users. So we have our customers and our end users, but I think definitely the same kind of message that Christina is describing. But yeah, I mean, I think for us, what's different is that we're hyper focused on the like customer sharing experience of data. And so we want our customers to be able to very effectively and easily share data with their customers. And kind of like the locus of like where we're starting is with dashboards that are embedded, but we're also thinking about other mechanisms and ways to share these dashboards to their customers. So like email, SMS, Slack, API, et cetera, and other types of like transportation methods, but also like different data assets too outside of the dashboard. Yeah, so that's kind of like the main kind of like interface and thesis that we're thinking about from the Xplo side. And I think like, you know, OneSchema and Xplo have a lot of intersections when it comes to the customer that's buying Xplo, also are like product leaders and developers as well.
Now, Barry, you don't have customers, do you? Or do you just have customers? Or are you also in this like
B2B
mental space?
Yeah, no, we have some of that. We do have people, we're not as focused on it as Xplo is, but we do have some people who will take Hex apps and publish them publicly or externally, or a classic thing would be like someone who wants to expose some analytics to a client. But 90-odd% of our usage is not like that. But there's a similar dynamic in that we have like creator editor users. Mm-hmm. So think like a data scientist or data analyst or just anyone writing SQL. And then we have consumers, and that is a very interesting dynamic, and it's a little bit different. But you know, the way this manifests for us is like there's kind of that experience of going through and editing and creating in Hex and publishing, and then there's a whole other set of experiences around discovery, around subscribing to topics, around being able to search for through the knowledge base in Hex for everything that the data team's ever produced, the experience of actually using an app that is published through Hex to ask and answer questions. So we do have some similar dynamics there, and I think an interesting thing maybe for other people starting companies in the data space might be, you know, we really focused initially correctly on the creator experience because they're the initial users, and you know, probably similar to Christina and Gary, there's like the engineers you're building for. But something we underappreciated, I would say, until recently is what that experience is like for those consumers, because those consumers, we don't even charge for them. So it's easy to sort of write them off, but they're the ones that are actually sort of attesting to the value that we create. I mean, it's great that we make the data scientist or data analyst experience more efficient, and those people certainly love our product. But especially when we're dealing with bigger and bigger customers, the value story is not like, hey, your data scientist likes this thing. The value is your data team is better able to communicate and influence decisions through the organization. So that experience of what that is like to consume work through Hex is really important. And what's interesting is that a lot of our economic stakeholders, the people actually holding the purse strings and the budget to be able to pay for a product like Hex, actually are people who are the type of people who are consuming the work from the data team. So having that be an awesome experience is actually really valuable for us at kind of a meta level. So it's a little different, but there is a similarity there in terms of these like two different types of personas that we really care about.
Yeah, and Barry, I think you made a really good point there about sort of the different parts of the sales and customer adoption cycle. Like the part that's really important at the beginning is getting customer to really like the product. They see all the features that are on their checklist, but to really, you know, drive that customer love, the renewals, them telling other people that they love their product, the end customer prime needs to see value from the product, and that happens later down the line, but is equally important.
Christina, do you consider OneSchema product led? Like, are the people adopting your product like individual engineers who are like, hey, I want to use this thing to solve a problem I have, or is it more sort of adopted at an organizational level initially?
Yeah, we have a sales-led go-to-market motion. So typically, an engineer or a product team will have CSV imports somewhere on their product roadmap. They know they already have a problem. And so then they go out proactively looking for solutions, make the build versus buy trade-off. Do I want to spend 6 months of engineering time building and maintaining this importer, or do I want to pay one schema for it? We definitely have thought a lot about self-serve, because you can imagine it would be the sort of thing that an individual engineer might pick up and put in the product. But and I would be really interested to get Gary's thoughts on what they've seen on this. Actually putting something inside of a production product is usually something that requires quite a lot of organizational buy-in. There's a huge amount of trust that the product is stable, that the product is compliant. If it's something that's going to be handling customer PII, we handle a ton of customer PII. So I have a hunch that allowing engineers to trial our product without having to talk to sales would be effective for us. But I don't think a true product-led engineer just picks it up, uses it, would work quite as well.
Yeah, in an ideal world, it's possible. But to your point, when like there's sensitive data, there are all these other kind of like, if there's HIPAA agreements and BAAs that need to be signed and whatnot, then it gets a little bit more sensitive and there's obviously intervention that's needed. In an ideal world, though, like a developer can come in, utilize one schema, Explo, whatever on their own, and then embed that into the actual product. That being said, though, like our team does kind of get involved, and we kind of understand who's using the product and kind of who's currently self-serving. And then like based on like our profile and our read of like who the company is and whatnot, we'll intervene and then appropriately kind of engage them based off like what we think their like size of company, scale of company, and what kind of needs they might have.
Gary, I'd imagine the fact that you're at Palantir for a while helps with that kind of analysis and that kind of customer engagement, where you can say like, hey, we know how your workflow uses. We'll send you somebody. Do the forward deploy engineer thing, or like think through what is happening from a customer level of what they need to give to their customers, right? And sort of thinking through what that journey looks like in the sales process.
Yeah. Barry has a lot of experience from Palantir as well, which is why I think he's giggling a little bit. But yeah, I think that Palantir has done a lot of things right with that regards, and making sure that the customer experience and the end user experience is fantastic. I think that we're definitely not trying to model exactly off of some of the things that they've done, but definitely want to make sure the customer experience is fantastic and really enjoyable by Explo customers and Explo end users.
So let me ask you something on this customer side, and for each of you, I think this is going to be relevant. And Christine, I'll start with you. First customer, who was it?
Oh man, first paying customer or
Yes.
First person using
paying customer? Otherwise, it's like a friend.
It was this company called 90.io. They're like an OKR software platform.
Okay, how did you find them?
I found them in our competitors' content marketing. They were listing a bunch of people. They did this survey called the State of Data Onboarding. And so I reached out to everybody in it, and they responded.
What was your original outreach to them? How did you convince them to take a meeting? Walk me through the sales process. How long did it take? What did you learn in that sales process?
Yeah, so I wrote them a cold email that just said, hey, it seems like you're having some trouble with CSV file. I saw that you were featured in this State of Data Onboarding. We're building a solution to solve problems like yours. Would love to hop on a conversation and see if there's a fit. And so the director of product management there agreed to hop on a call. We talked her through our solution, and she took a chance on us. The product was really early at that stage. We didn't charge her very much money, probably because we shouldn't have charged her very much money, but they're still a customer today. They use the product every day. Yeah, I think that really it was just, a series of demos. We did a huge amount of work hand-holding them through that initial implementation, just because, of course, we were a really early company and learned a lot from that too.
Have you managed to adjust the pricing to where it should be at this point, or are they still paying way too little?
They're still paying way too little. We haven't invested that much in upselling our old customers. And also, it's sort of a thank you. Like, you took a chance on us early. You get to be grandfathered into this extremely cheap tier while all of our customers are, paying a much higher price for this product.
What was the biggest barrier that you faced when trying to onboard them? Was it the PII thing? Was it being embedded in their production?
It's always trust, right? When you're at the earliest stages of your business and people don't trust that you're not going to waste their time, and they don't trust that you're not going to mess up their data. People are very sensitive, especially we handle almost exclusively customer PII because it happens during onboarding flows. And so I think working with their team to build confidence that our engineering team knew what they were doing and the product was going to work and that was actually going to solve a real problem for them is that biggest barrier with your first customer.
Makes sense. Barry, how about you? First customer, who was it?
First customer was a company, it was actually Glossier in New York. And we knew one of the folks on the data team there from a past job, a previous colleague of ours. And he was someone that we had actually initially gone and like visited their office when we still had a job. We saw jobs being like, hey, you guys like, initially the outreach was actually much less. My journey to Hex was actually, I started as a buyer. Like I was looking for something like Hex to solve a problem I had, and kind of did a survey of the market, and there was nothing out there. And but really, it started with a lot of conversations with people on other data teams, being like, "Hey, do y'all have this problem? And if so, like, what are you doing to solve it?" And the consistent thing we were hearing is, "No, we do have this problem. We haven't found anything that solves it well." So that was actually an.
Sorry, do you remember the specific thing they were? What was the specific use case that they had at Glossier at the time?
Yeah, it was. They had a bunch of Jupyter notebooks floating around. They were doing, analytics in, and then they were trying to share them out. And they had some scripts that. And the classic thing we saw at all sorts of companies was like, okay, I do my work in this local notebook, and it's like hard to connect to data. It's hard to work on this. It's, no collaboration at all. And then if I want to communicate the results of it, I'm either screenshotting charts, or if I want it to feel more like integrated with our stack, I deploy the notebook to some cron scheduler that runs it overnight, that dumps the data into Snowflake so we can look at it in Looker. And it was like this crazy Rube Goldberg machine. And that was exactly what we had been doing. It's exactly what a bunch of other people had been doing. And it sort of took me a couple months of like banging my head against the wall of being like, well, where is this product? Why has no one solved this? To realize like, well, actually, this is a cool opportunity and someone should do this, and maybe it should be us. But that experience of going and talking to a bunch of people who had the problem, almost pre-company idea, was actually a really, really good way to get started, because I think a lot of founders will have like an idea, and they'll be like excited about their startup idea, and they want to go pitch everyone their idea. And like, Aaron, you know this better than any of us because this was your job for many years. Like those ideas are often like directionally correct, but they're off by some number of degrees between, all the way up to 180 degrees off. And I think it was helpful for us spending a lot of time in the problem space before we like leapt forward into the idea space. It was almost like a gift we got by accident, that I think a lot of other founders make the mistake of like jumping forward. And I think what made those early sales kind of easy for us is that we had already talked to these customers a bunch. Like all our early customers were people we knew. And we'd already talked to them a bunch about their problem before we had gotten into like, well, let's go build a thing. And that was, in retrospect, a very good way to get started on this.
Had you also discussed things like pricing with them before you started building?
No, and it took us a while to get confident and really put forward on pricing. No, and that was one of the things I think we were hesitant initially to really put forward. And I think we had that classic early founder like lack of confidence. Will someone actually pay for this? The second I ask for $1, are they going to run away? And like, in retrospect, it was very obvious that we built something compelling, but it was also clear that if the second you ask for $1, if customers do run away, you're probably not creating real value. So that's something to run toward, not run away from. But yeah.
Yeah, I've gotten more and more confident in the idea that you should actually be extremely expensive, because if you are expensive, obviously there's always relative bounds around what expensive means, because I found that, as a buyer, as a founder, and talking to founders, when something's cheap, you assume that it is cheap, right? You assume that the quality is fairly low. Whereas if you say, look, this is expensive because it's super high quality, and then you deliver on that, people will think, oh, I'm going to invest time and energy in making this right. Especially
the tension early on though, Aaron, is like when you're 3 months into building the thing and you're 3 founders and it's stacked in a trench coat. You often don't have that confidence and that swagger of this is high quality, right? Like, and I think that's where founders can sometimes get it wrong a little bit early on. And we certainly made our fair share of mistakes on this, but I think the way to approach it really is about building that relationship that's anchored in the problem. I think that this place you have to start with a customer is you have to be the person who understands their problem better than anyone. You have to have that really deep empathy because they're going to have to go through a lot of bullshit to work with you. They're going to have to go through bugs and rough edges and all of this, and it probably won't feel like a premium, high quality product for your first few customers. And so you have to build that trust and that empathy around the problem first. I think too many founders come into the first meeting with a design partner and will be like, hey, do you want to buy this thing? Let me demo it to you and pitch it. And actually, like, there's some time you need to spend up front for them to want to tolerate the fact that it's going to be pretty low quality early on. It just is. Like, your product is going to suck early on, and that's the reality. And you have to have people who are so excited about the problem you're solving that they're willing to work through that with you.
Right. Yeah, they're so excited. Like, they need the thing solved so badly that they're willing to.
That's it. That's it. This has to be such a problem for them. I've got this phrase that I picked up at a past job that I've kind of pushed out a lot. It's called commitment engineering, and it starts with this idea of, like, you have to find someone who has got this problem, and you have to really understand that problem, and then you need to ask for mutual commitments. And those don't have to be money, but you can ask for a commitment like, hey, if I built a first version of this and came back in a few weeks, would you take another half hour and click around in it? You're not asking them for money, but you're asking them for, like, a commitment of time. Yeah. And then you say, you do that session and they give you a bunch of feedback. You go, hey, if we iterated on this and addressed all of your feedback and came back with another version in a few weeks, would you invite someone else from your team in and do the demo and click session with them? Again, you're not asking them for money, but you're asking them for, like, some social capital, right?
Right.
And if they say no, it is good evidence that you are not solving a compelling enough problem, or they do not have enough confidence in you solving that problem. And you can keep going with that loop. You can ask, well, would you demo this to your boss? Would you use this for a day instead of the old thing? Would you blah, blah, blah? And eventually one of those commitments can be money, but there's ways to test and validate that you're on the right track, that you're solving a real problem, and that they are engaged with you and willing to invest with you in that, short of an economic transaction, if you don't feel like you're at that point yet. But I think it's important that you do ask for commitments from your early customers, early design partners. Otherwise, it's very easy for them to be like, yeah, sounds like a cool idea. If you come up with something, I'd love to take a look at it. And you're like, oh man, they really want this thing. You can really fool yourself with that if you're not pushing to get commitments and buy-in from them in those early phases, even if it's not cash.
I want to come back to this in a second after I ask Gary the same question around first customer, specifically around the way that you're talking about the use of social capital and the commitment of time, and even the language around something like a design partner is language that we normally use when talking about enterprise level software, which normally we talk about like high 6, low 7, high 7, 8-figure contracts. But I think there's so just remind me if I forget to come back to it, because I really want to. Gary, first customer, who was it?
Yeah, it was this company called Zuddle, who puts on virtual events as like a software platform. But kind of to piggyback off of a little bit of what Barry was saying earlier. So I'm not sure if everyone knows this. Aaron was our YC partner. And when we first applied to YC, we applied with an idea totally out of left field. It's not even in the data space. It was like building the Netflix for restaurant recipes. And then to your point earlier, it was like, we did this whole 180 kind of like spin and kind of like shifted away from that pretty quickly. And so during YC, we were actually building an internal facing data analytics product. And the idea was that we wanted folks to be able to easily explore their own data. And, to the point of like, being in the data space previously at previous roles and kind of like digging our feet deep and really understanding what our customers want, we kind of fell into a lot of these traps that, Christina and Barry have both said already, that we were building something potentially not with like the strongest design partner, kind of building and people with like checking it out, thinking it was cool, thinking that was like some like semblance of traction, and then kind of finding ourselves in this like interesting spot of like, oh wait, like, is this real usage? Is it not? But what was interesting is that a lot of our customers were kind of like asking for this like very similar trend of kind of requests around like, hey, like, we think what you're doing is awesome, but clearly they're not using it in a real way, but they want to show their customers a similar level of like tooling that they could analyze analytics with and analyze various forms of data. And that's actually kind of like where we got the idea for what Explo is today. We're like, great. So seems like people aren't as interested in this like internal facing analysis because there are other forms of tools that are pretty well built out. and that's tackling the problem. But there seems to be a gap in the data tech stack when it comes to this like more external facing, customer facing utility. And that's when we actually started engaging with our existing customers, founders that we have in our network to kind of chat about this idea. And that's where we met the Zettel team, who was very kind of like trying to find a way to show data to their event coordinators about how these virtual events went on. So remember, this was like during like kind of peak COVID. So virtual events were the hot thing back then, I guess potentially still now too. And so they're putting on a bunch of virtual events, but did not have an effective way to share a lot of the results of those events to their customers. Who signed up, how many people like actually went, how long people spent in these, fireside chat rooms, what virtual pamphlets were picked up, et cetera. And so that's when we really realized we were solving, a problem that people were actually interested in, because we shipped a product that, transparently had a ton of bugs. But the difference between the old product, I guess Explo 1.0 and Explo 2.0 is that, they didn't actually care. They still wanted to work with us, and they were still pushing really hard. And that's when we knew that we were actually, the feeling of traction and usage was actually very different. And like the dichotomy was what we realized that we were actually potentially, tracking like a real use case here that we're really excited for. And that's how we kind of like formulated and created Explo. And we had a great design partner, Zettel, to start with, and we got a bunch more in the upcoming months after that.
Okay, so you're both using this term design partner. And we're talking about this sort of very in-depth process of actually designing a product alongside either one or a small number of possible customers. And traditional wisdom has always been, hey, if you're doing enterprise software, that makes sense because they're going to pay you so much that it's worth building all these custom use cases and designing the interface around their specific needs. And then you figure out what's generalizable. And customer one, customer two, you edit it a little bit and you kind of get to a more, common language. And then eventually it's something that's usable across all cases. But here, we're not talking about multi-million-dollar contracts. And so there's a natural, or maybe you are eventually, depending on like how large the contracts you get are. But there's a tension there in terms of how much time you spend with early customers designing for their custom case versus stepping back and saying, hey, are we going to be able to easily deploy this to multiple people? Or maybe that isn't a tension at all. So Christine, like, how do you think about that in terms of your first customer to maybe customers, and I don't know how many customers you have at this point, but let's say 2 through 5 through 10, as you think about how quickly you need to start seeing whether or not what you're doing applies to other people, and how you figure out what stays and what goes in the product as it evolves.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we made this as a huge mistake with customer two, who was sort of a design partner. They had this use case where they needed to do a lot of validating of address data. So you're like, great, we want to be the solution that can, validate any kind of data for you as part of, this vision of helping people transform their data and get into the right format. So we invested a huge amount in geocoding. We built this very fancy system that would fall back on 3 different geocoders and actually worked quite well with their data. And then they didn't use it because it turned out that they didn't have a big enough pain point. So that was just kind of some legacy craft that sat around in our product. We deprecated it pretty recently. But it's definitely a thing that can happen. You can over-rotate on, one of those early customers, especially at those early stages. It's hard to get people to work with you because, like Barry was saying, there's just so much you have to invest in that trust relationship before they're willing to even, spend the time to continue talking to you and try the product. So if you have someone who wants something, it's just very tempting to go build it. But, over time you make progress, you have more customers, you write case studies and your product gets a lot better, which just helps a lot. I remember the difference between like the conversations where you're like, will you please use the product? And then people start asking you like, how much does it cost? And I'm like, oh my God, they're assuming this product costs money. And then, to the stages where, obviously the product costs money and it just, continues to build into something that's better and better. But I do think that, over the course of thousands of customer conversations, it's kind of like Barry was saying, like they had the opportunity to have all of those conversations before they even wrote a line of code. It does become really clear the things that are a priority to your customer profile. Another thing I'll mention about this that I think is so, so important is being really specific about who you're selling to as early as possible, because you're just going to get so much noise in terms of the things that people ask for if your customer profile is too broad.
Okay,
Totally
so
agree.
that, let me just pick up on that one, because this is a tricky thing. Early founder needs customers, says, I'm going to talk to anyone who's willing to talk to me, right? At what point does that change to, I know enough to focus on a specific either customer type or use case?
I think you have to make bets. Sometimes you think you know and you don't know. The first version of our product was not an embeddable tool. It was a standalone product that we hosted that an internal team would use to clean data and import it into the product. That was wrong. And we didn't figure out it was wrong until we saw the usage numbers, because people told us that they wanted it and they paid money for it. They just didn't use it in the way that we had hoped. The usage numbers weren't there and people kept asking us for the embeddable thing. So eventually we just committed to that. We said, you know what? This other product line is not working as well as the embedded one, and we really invested in embedding, and that has been growing a lot better than the other product line.
Barry, how do you think about that tension?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I think it's one of the benefits, and I would even go as far as to say like an imperative that I tell other founders of starting a company in a space you know well. We had the benefit and the fortune to start a company in a space that we've been operating in for like 10 years. So there's traps there for sure. Like, you can bring too much baggage in and you can assume too much. Like there's downsides to, the virtue of fresh eyes, but like, honestly, we had a pretty clear-eyed sense of some stuff early on, and there was some stuff that we obviously had to learn along the way, but the one thing I will say on this front is like, I think there's the real tension I have felt in the past, and I even feel sometimes today on this, is like, you will have a conviction you feel, or you'll have a thesis, and you'll sometimes have this wisdom, this conventional wisdom, which is not necessarily wrong, but like, we're focusing on a narrow customer, and you'll have a thesis, and you'll keep getting pulled and pulled and pulled. And the hard thing is separating like when that pull is a distraction from like what is definitely true versus like, oh, actually there is something over here. And we did have, one of those moments where there was a set of features that we knew we wanted to build eventually around supporting like better environment management and SQL stuff. We were like, hey, we kept hearing about it, and we kept being like, well, no, that's not what we're focused on right now. Everyone keeps saying ruthless focus, and we're ruthless focus, and we're being so good. And then it turns out the second we actually went and actually listened to people and spent like a month building the thing, it like 10x'd our user base, and it was like, oh shit, like. So you're touching on something real, and I don't know that I have a formula other than like, I think just having spent a lot of time in the space helped us have an instinctive sense of the right places to invest. And I'm very proud of the amount we've gotten done in 3 years. I'm very proud of the amount that we've caught up to and surpassed folks who may have been working for longer. And I think part of that is just having that intuition from our own experiences on what were the things worth building. Like we kind of skied close to the gates, if you will, and that really helped us out a lot.
Definitely. We have a product manager and an engineer on the founding team. And when thinking about things that product managers and engineers care about, it's so much easier if you can really put yourself in the shoes of your customer, because you have faced similar problems to them.
And we're here, this is ostensibly a fireside chat about starting companies and founding in the data space. And Aaron, you're bringing up this point about, earlier we were talking about this thing between like enterprise and engaging really deeply with customers, despite them not being 7 figures. I think one of the fundamental challenges in the data space, and Christina's hit on this a little bit, is that people who care about their data care about their data. Like people who are doing a lot of things with data are usually pretty sensitive about where that data goes and what happens with it. And it's different than if you're building like a B2C app, or you're building something that's like another note-taking app or whatever, where like you don't necessarily need access to the customer's most critical data. I would argue for all 3 of us, there's probably an imperative that for our customers to get value out of the product, they're having to connect it to their most important data and data workflows. And for better or for worse, that does mean often you have to engage and embed pretty deeply with a customer early on to build the level of trust, to have them be comfortable and confident in what you're doing. It's not something that usually lends itself to like a quick drive-by, I'll just plug it into your Snowflake. Like that's actually a conversation at a lot of customers, and there's a lot of investment that has to go into that. So I think for other people considering starting companies in the data space, you have to come into that eyes wide open and know that you're likely signing up for a good amount of overhead just to get in the door at the customers or design partners, which unfortunately raises the stakes of who you're choosing to work with in those types of relationships.
Yeah. Gary, when you've taken that question, right, of, hey, we're going to take your data and show it to your customers. By the way, if we screw this up, we're going to piss off all your customers and they're going to be angry.
We're going to put the wrong data to the wrong customers.
I mean, what do you do to make sure that you're doing this right?
Yeah, I mean, I think as everyone's already said, the biggest thing is building trust with the customer and allowing them to kind of understand how the data flows through the platform, how the data is managed and used from the Explo side, but also like how that data segregation works, right? So how do we ensure customer A only sees customer A's data, how customer B only sees customer B's data, and then the other piece here is like a security piece. Like how can we ensure if like customer A suddenly becomes adversarial, they can't find a way to see customer C's data. And so really a lot of that is like whether in documentation, discussions, showcasing other use cases that we have through case studies and really kind of building that trust is super important to kind of communicate. I guess at the end of the day, though, a lot of the utilities and kind of like frameworks that we have set up is not too dissimilar from other tools, whether internal or not, that have set up as well when it comes to like segregating data. So it's not like a new paradigm, so to speak. So it's not like reteaching like a new mindset shift that people have to have, but it's definitely just ensuring and kind of confirming that Explo can effectively do that, which it obviously can, and people like to see. But one thing I wanted to add a little earlier was about the discussion of like design partners. I think what's very interesting here that we talk about a lot as a team, especially as of late, is that super early on, you have these design partners that whether they're paying you a little bit of money or not, you want to make them happy. They give you a certain set of feedback and like the features to work on. You're probably staying up all night, iterating on them, shipping them the next day. You want to show them really quickly that you're moving fast, but also being a good partner. The interesting question is, at what point do you start to kind of pull back from certain requests and say, hey, no, like to Barry's point, like, hey, these certain set of requests, might be critical, but they're not part of our roadmap. Do we kind of lean in that direction and head in that direction? Versus the flip side is like, there's another set of like feature requests that seem important to your team, but not important to our other customers. When do we know to like start saying no essentially to certain requests and then follow, other threads that we have, other requests that we have, and make sure that we're still following generally the roadmap that we've, prescribed, knowing that it obviously can change. I think is a super interesting question that, we talk about internally as a team a lot. And, saying no for the first time to a customer is also a very interesting moment as well.
Yeah, and I think this, in some ways, if you ask that question of a consumer startup, you say to a consumer startup, hey, how do you decide what features to build? It's a little bit of, I don't know, seemed like a good idea. I'm going to go do that. And maybe there's some data behind it, but maybe not, especially in the early days. Y'all are building data startups. Theoretically, everything you do should be, built on data. But I think the reality is that especially early in the life of a company and even midlife of a company, large product decisions are intuitive. You can have data backup, but you ultimately will not get perfect confidence from surveys, from customer conversations, none of that, because often people don't even know what they need. You just have to intuit what it is. And so the question then is, what's the testing framework you build around your experiments to know if you've just skied off the slope or found the new trail, right? So Christina, how do you evaluate the new features you want to build? You're going to spend a lot of time building something. Do you have gates along the way to say, hey, we're on the right path, we're on the wrong path? Or do you build something, release it, and see what happens?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two questions we ask whenever we're considering building a feature for a particular customer. The first is this customer in our ideal customer profile? If they're not in our ideal customer profile, what they need is not as important as what other customers need, because they're not on our path to where we're going. The second question is, what is important to our ideal customer profile? And what I mean by that is not in terms of the feature that would solve their problem, but what are the things that keep them up at night? What are the metrics that they're responsible for reporting back to their manager? And for us, it is onboarding completion rates. So like, do people actually successfully complete their onboardings, and engineering time? So how much engineering time are they spending building and maintaining a CSV importer? So to the extent we can launch features that we can use to demonstrate those really, really critical value props to our customers during the sales cycles, those are things that we prioritize. If they're things that, will help us close like one medium-sized deal, but it's not really hitting on those core value props for our ICP, not as high priority. We will definitely prioritize features for, landmark deals, like a really big logo or a really large contract size. That may not be as on roadmap for other customers, but even for those sorts of deals, if the customer isn't in the ICP, it's really not worth going after.
Barry, how do you think about that same question? You're a larger organization, multiple product, pods and all kinds of things going on. How do you think about this? How do you think about allocating resources across the company against different projects? And how do you, sitting on top of all that, look down and say, this is a direction we're going to keep going in, this is one we're not?
Yeah, it's tough. And I'll admit we're about 50 people now. So we're kind of coming into and in the middle of a phase where some of the stuff that worked early to do this doesn't. And I think we were just talking about that. Sometimes you have to make bets, and sometimes there has to be a level of intuition on it. And I think that works early on, and early on you can set some parameters around it. I think now, as a founder and leader, and still someone who's very tied into our product strategy, I'm trying to manage it more through having big theme, being able to manage a little bit more from, hey, here's an overall strategy, here's some themes, here are goals we want to achieve for the product to be able to achieve on some horizon that we're planning on. We kind of talk in basically a 6-month horizon when it comes to sort of like the big things we're going to tackle, and then we have quarterly planning for specific projects. But I'm trying to put those things out and say, these are the things we're really excited and want to invest in. And we've got those themes internally and everyone knows what they are. And then I think the best thing I can do now at the scale we're at, and certainly the scale I'd like to be at in the future, is have really empowered people on the ground who are able to go and make those decisions. And I'm there to help them make trade-offs and make sure we're actually tracking toward them. So that's a really big change. And it's a big mental shift. And I think it's something that's hard as a founder, where I've spent the last 2.5 years or whatever it is now, basically doing nothing but thinking about the product decisions every day, to moving toward, hey, I'm going to pull back and work at this higher level. And I'm now allocating resources less of like, okay, Steve, you're going to work on this feature this week. And then Jessica, you're going to tag it on this thing. And then you're on support next week. Like, that was my mode of allocating time and investment and resources for a long time. But now it's this sort of more macro thing where I almost feel like I'm funding projects. Where I'm like, yes, we were going to put 3 people on this for a quarter. And then I'm not involved in a lot of the day-to-day trade-offs. That's been a challenging transition, to be honest. And it's a very interesting one for me.
Thanks for that. I'm going to turn for a second, just in sort of our closing minutes, to how the world is changing right now. There's a lot being written about it, a lot being talked, and I'm sure it's something you face every day. But as venture funding slows down, as various parts of the economy slow down, all that kind of thing, the 3 of you are building products that are immensely useful, solve problems, but could theoretically be built internally. Maybe not as well, but people have been like kludging answers together for a long time to things of this sort. So 2 questions. 1, have you noticed a material change in buyer behavior over the last quarter or 2? And 2, forgot what 2 was. So let's just do 1 first. And if I remember it, I'll come back to it.
Yeah, I can go. I'll fully admit, yes. I think like a lot of founders, startups won't talk about it, but yeah, 100%. And every founder I talk to, every CEO I talk to is seeing the same thing. And whether we're coming into a more prolonged macro slowdown, or it's a blip or whatever, you can't escape the fact that over the last quarter or 2, deal cycles are stretching. There's more scrutiny on new spend. We've had customers that we had gotten up to a larger number of seats have layoffs, and then the seats contract. That's just the reality. And I think it is painful in the moment, but I think it is good, because it is good for us as individual founders and companies, but I think it's good for the ecosystem because it raises the stakes and it raises the heat on, are you building something essential? Are you building something that truly has value for existing customers that they can't get rid of? And are you building something that is so compelling that new customers need to bring you in? And I think it's going to be a real moment of honesty for a lot of people that we're really going to find out the answers here. And there's things, Aaron, you were just asking how we make decisions. There are things I'm pivoting us into from a product investment perspective where I'm saying, hey, this is going to help us be stickier, higher gravity, more essential. This is going to help us break into bigger ACV accounts that are likely less sensitive to short-term fluctuations in VC funding. In response to that, we all hope it's a short little V-shaped thing, but like we have to plan as if it's not. And I think you have to, it's a moment for honesty and rigor on the value you're providing to make sure that we can all build big businesses on the other side of this.
Yeah. I mean, like we've definitely seen customers take longer to decide and kind of evaluate Xplo. And then also like, the packages they would normally kind of sign up for have kind of changed as well. But what's interesting is that I think that, Xplo kind of sees ourselves as part of this category that's like the necessity, but like not a core competency of the company, right? It's not the reason why the company is going to become $1 billion company. And I think it's like actually a fantastic place to be, because as companies need to tighten budgets, potential unfortunate layoffs might happen. Well, all of their core engineers are going to be working on the core competency, the reason why, they're a strong business. And then they're going to be outsourcing different parts of the platform that are necessities, payments to Stripe, authentication to Auth0. And the idea is to then be that other part of the stack. You want analytics, you want dashboards. Great. We're not going to build that out in-house because we want, so-and-so to be focused on the reason why we're going to win as a business. Let's use Xplo to handle this other piece of the business that we know we need. And so it's like, so that we've actually really seen changes, to Barry's point. I think that's for sure like impossible to avoid. But I think I would like to say probably all three companies here, fortunately, haven't been rocked in the ways that other companies might have been rocked. But I mean, it's hard to know, and I think only time will really tell. But I think we've, so far so good, and going to keep, pushing forward and pushing strong.
Yeah, we're in a very similar spot to Xplo in terms of where we fit for what customers need. I think there's ROI has been coming up a lot in customer conversations lately as, budgets are tightening and procurement teams, they want to know what the ROI story is for a product like WinSchema or Xplo. I think that, usually if you get to that point in the conversation, it's a reasonably easy sell. If you can convince someone that you're going to save, even one or half of an engineering headcount, you can charge quite a lot of money for that product. But before it was kind of like, yes, this makes sense. Now they want the numbers of why it makes sense and how much it makes sense. So that's been a change we've seen.
Back to your point earlier, Christine, about sales led. I think this is a time where you're going to see a lot of companies. I'm very big believer in PLG. A lot of our growth has been product led, but we also have a fantastic sales team. And I think it's a time where a lot of companies, especially in the data space, are going to have a lot of value from empathetic, consultative sales teams that can partner with customers on making that ROI story. In an era of loose corp cards, PLG and swiping, bottoms up, I think it sounds great. In this kind of era, those types of conversations, especially as you're moving up market into areas that are less sensitive to, as I was saying, or less sensitive to like the fluctuations of VC. I actually think salespeople are going to be more at a premium than less.
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up, both because I think that's really good advice. And it's a really good way of thinking about where you position your product, how you think about who adopts the product and how you sell to them. Especially for something where I think at first blush, a lot of people might look at products like yours and say, oh, this is an easy thing to cut. And it is the opposite. This is actually something that customers need that they're not going to be able to do on their own. Which puts you all in pretty good shape. So I hope other founders watching and listening can think about their own positioning from that point of view. Not everything is terrible, even when things are pretty bad. There's always a way to, I think, as a startup, because you are small and nimble, right? Because you're building things that are useful, and you've demonstrated that because people are willing to pay you, there's a way to turn that into an advantage for you. So thank you, all three of you, for a pretty fascinating conversation. Thanks for letting me host. This was great.
Thanks for hosting, Aaron, and thanks for putting this together, Gary.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it.
Cheers all.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.